To the untrained eye, there can be subtle but huge differences between a student fashion design portfolio and a professional fashion design portfolio. And these differences can make or break your chances of getting a job. In this video, we're gonna go through what those differences are, and if you're a fashion design student, what changes you can make to your student portfolio to make it look more professional. We're also gonna cover how you can break into a new category, even if your student work or past professional work doesn't have anything to do with that category. I'm Heidi, founder of SuccessfulFashionDesigner.com, and I teach fashion designers like you the real world skills you need to get ahead in this cutthroat industry. All the stuff you don't learn at fashion school. A lot of people don't talk about this stuff, so I like to call it fashion industry secrets revealed. Now, the advice in this video isn't just stuff I made up. It's stuff I've learned over a decade working professionally in the industry, and it's also stuff that I've learned after doing over 75 interviews with fashion professionals on my podcast, Successful Fashion Designer. These designers have landed their dream job at brands like Lululemon, DKNY, and Under Armour, and they've used these exact strategies to present an exceptional fashion design portfolio. I've handpicked their best advice from our podcast interviews and packaged them up into this short video for you. If you want to check out the full interview, they're all linked below in the description. Oh, and pro tip, if you have any questions that I don't cover in this video, I wrote an entire book, How to Create Your Fashion Portfolio in a Weekend. It's absolutely free. All right, let's start out. The first biggest difference between a student fashion portfolio and a professional portfolio is the idea of commercial design versus conceptual design. It's the wacky stuff you see on the runway versus the real life stuff you actually see in stores. Now, in fashion school, they teach you to be super artistic and they encourage you to do these very conceptual designs. But in the real world, brands create commercial, everyday clothes for everyday people. And no offense, but a lot of brands don't really care that much about your gorgeous and artistic conceptual designs. Now, the strategies between commercial and conceptual work, what brands really need versus what you learn to do in school, comes up so often on the podcast. And in this video, I'm gonna share two specific examples. The first is from Carla Louise Stout, who I interviewed in episode 60. Now, Carla's been a designer for over 15 years, and she has had the most phenomenal career trajectory. But when she first started out, she applied and interviewed for over 20 jobs without getting a single offer. All the brand said was, we need you to have some experience before we can hire you, but she was stuck trying to get her first experience. What Carla realized is that her portfolio was very conceptual. So she did a few self-directed projects that were very commercial, put them in her portfolio, and almost immediately she landed her first fashion design job. Because as Carla talked about in her interview, the industry is not as airy-fairy as it is in design school. You're not basing things off of some tree that's blowing in the wind from this poem from the 19th century. Your work has to be more relevant to trends that are going on and to commercial-driven clothes that real people are actually wearing. Because I hate to break it to you, I've talked about this in other videos, but the crazy conceptual stuff that you see on the runway does not actually go to market. So yes, while some brands create these crazy conceptual designs, that is not what you're gonna be designing. Stuff on the runway is created for PR and marketing and presentation purposes only. And that stuff is being created by the designers at the top of the chain. You may get there someday, and you can, but to start, you're gonna be at the bottom and you're gonna be working on designing the everyday clothes for everyday people. The next example of this comes from Bjorn Bengtsson, who I interviewed on the very first episode of the Successful Fashion Designer podcast. Now, Bjorn's been in the industry for over 20 years. He's a design director and he does a lot of hiring. He's worked for brands like Theory and Greg Norman. And being in a hiring position, Bjorn knows what he wants to see in someone's portfolio. I'm gonna let him tell you in his own words.
Schoolwork is many times very conceptual and not always applicable to what goes on in the industry from a commercial standpoint. So develop something by yourself that you feel could be good for those 5 to 10 companies you really want to interview with. And then when you show your portfolio, actually develop time in developing something that you feel is relevant from a commercial standpoint.
So if you don't have any commercial work that you've done because you've not yet worked in the industry, you can either pull some projects from an internship or do some self-directed projects to put in your portfolio. Just make sure that they're based on what's actually in the market and what brands are actually selling on their website or in stores. Now, the next big difference between a student fashion portfolio and a professional one is showing irrelevant projects versus showing tight, cohesive collections that actually relate to the brand. What does this even mean? Well, I boiled this down to the portfolio golden rule. And if you've read my free book on portfolios, then you've read this before. Here it is again. This project, collection, or design speaks to the brand, tells them that I understand their market, customer, and aesthetic, and visually shows them that I am the right designer for the job. Now, a lot of fashion design students, their portfolio, as we mentioned, can be very conceptual. They also just want to shove every project they've ever done in there. But your portfolio is about quality and relevance to the brand, not quantity. It's better to show just a handful of relevant projects from an internship or from self-directed projects than to show a bunch of stuff that doesn't even make sense to them. A specific example of this came up when I interviewed Sheena Schoolcraft in episode 11 of my podcast. Sheena's worked for brands like DKNY and Tommy Hilfiger, and she is in a position to interview and hire designers. She knows what she wants to see in a portfolio and what she doesn't. Sheena specifically says it is a waste of time to show too many projects. Everybody is so busy that if you show too many projects and stuff that's irrelevant, people just wind up getting kind of annoyed. Sheena suggests a maximum of 3 to 6 projects that are super relevant, because by the time you show your inspiration and your trends and your mood board and your color story, it gets to be a lot of pages, so that is more than enough. Because here's the thing, if you're applying for a position for woven tops and you show a bunch of evening wear dresses, it doesn't even make sense. As beautiful as your designs may be, you're wasting everybody's time. And one of Sheena's best pieces of advice is to send your portfolio as small PDF files. That way you can customize what each brand sees. Now, I realize if you're a student, you might not have that much work to choose from, but just really think about if you're showing evening wear dresses to a brand that you're applying to design swimsuits, just think about what really makes sense. And when you go in for an interview with your physical portfolio, pull pages out that are irrelevant, or at least tuck them in the very back. Don't flip through 100 pages of irrelevant projects just because you're sitting there in person. Now, this came up again on episode 53 when I interviewed Shelly Simpson, who runs the fashion recruiting department for a large staffing agency in New York City. And Shelly cautions designers against sending brands to a full website unless your website is hyper-focused on that specific category. Why? Because it's hard to control what people will or won't see on your website, where they may or may not click. And it's really easy for them to get confused and turned off by seeing something that's irrelevant to them. Here's Shelly in her own words explaining this further.
As far as like a website goes, this is where I typically, unless your website is very specific and caters to a certain audience, and I want my client to see that, I typically avoid sending that to clients, because sometimes you can have such an array of work and you just don't want them clicking on the wrong link and being like, oh, she does swimwear, even though, you know, you're applying to them for like a knits position. Mm-hmm. You just want to make sure that if you are presenting that to a client or, you know, somewhere you're applying, that it's a fit for what they're looking for. Otherwise, you never know where they're going to end up on your website. So it just needs to be very well thought out if you do, you know, intend to send that out.
So again, unless your website is super focused on just what that brand wants to see for that specific category, consider sending customized PDFs for each job. I will remind you of the portfolio golden rule again. This project, collection, or design speaks to the brand, tells them that I understand their market, customer, and aesthetic, and visually shows them that I am the right designer for the job. I talk about all of this in much more depth and answer every question you could possibly have about your fashion portfolio in my free book. But before you go clicking away, here's how you can break into a new category, even if your past schoolwork or past professional work has nothing to do with that category. Now, we've talked about self-directed projects in this video earlier, but a question that a lot of designers have is it actually okay to show that stuff in your portfolio? Can I put stuff in there that hasn't actually gone into production? Yes, you can. And this is exactly what Layla Jalili did, who I interviewed in episode 49. Now, Layla's worked for brands like Helly Hansen and Under Armour, but when she first got started in the industry out of school, she didn't have any experience in outerwear. She wanted to get into snowboarding and high action sports, but nothing in her portfolio reflected this. So she did a bunch of self-directed projects, and that's how she landed her first job. Beyond this, Layla and I brainstormed a bunch of cool ways on the podcast that you can add relevant work to your portfolio even if you don't have formal experience. Look for design competitions that you can enter. This may be a competition that a brand is having or that a trade show is putting on. Maybe you offer to help a startup for free. Now, I have thoughts on working for free, and it boils down to this. If you initiate the project and you tell the brand or the startup or the person that you're working for free to gain experience, and you put very clear parameters on what the project's going to be, then it is okay. Where I really suggest you don't work for free is if a brand approaches you and asks you to do it to gain exposure. That is abusive. I know another person in the industry who has a friend who they give each other design inspiration boards, and then they each design a collection off of that. So get creative, work with other people, figure out ways you can get the experience before you have the experience. One last example comes from Hillary Glenn, who I interviewed in episode 35. Now, Hillary had lived in New York City and she had worked for a bunch of really high-end brands, but she was moving to Colorado where there's a lot of lifestyle and activewear brands. She didn't have a lot of this kind of work in her portfolio, so she did do some self-directed projects. But beyond this, she went into interviews with sample projects that she created specifically for those brands, and she showed them her ideas. So not only was she impressing the brand with the sample project, she then had more content to add to her portfolio. There are a million ways you can come up with to get creative with this, so do that and then add some commercial work to your student portfolio. Because remember, the two biggest things that are going to make your portfolio look more professional and less student is having commercial-driven work and only showing stuff that's relevant to the brand. Again, for more specific tips, visual examples, and answers to all your questions, check out my free book on portfolios. And to listen to the full-length interview with all of the guests who I mentioned in this video, check out the links in the description below. In the meantime, if you like this video, please click the subscribe button and give the video a thumbs up. I really do appreciate it, and it does help quite a bit. And for more free tips, tutorials, and advice on getting ahead in the cutthroat fashion industry, head on over to successfulfashiondesigner.com and sign up for my email list. I share tons of stuff there that you don't see on YouTube. I'd also love to hear from you. What surprised you most about the difference between a student fashion design portfolio and a professional one? Let me know below by leaving a comment. Got you, little bug. Not podcast, it's not a podcast, it's a video.